Hi, this is John Sablan, one half of To Have and To Hold podcast, and Nichole and I are so very blessed that you decided to join us on this journey to improve your marriage, your family life, and your relationships. Now, as a disclaimer, Nichole and I are not perfect. We're not your counselors, and we don't desire to be your spiritual directors. What we do desire, though, is to lend this podcast as an opportunity for us to journey together in holiness and virtue, and to share our experiences of marriage and family life, and what we've learned, what we've encountered, so that it may bless you and your family and your relationships. Now, if you disagree, or if your experience is different, or perhaps if we say something in mistake or in error, you are free to absolutely reject it, my dear brother and sister in Christ. So we just wanted to leave that with you, and we thank you again for your support and most especially your prayers. So please share, like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and let us know how God is blessing you through this podcast. May God bless you and keep you always.
Look at these eyebrows. There's not a way that I can, I can have a pleasant face. I mean, it just automatically goes like this. And there's no way of hiding it, right? I'm upset. You can see it. And sometimes I like to put my hand up on my hip. We're not going to dip.
And you dip, we dip.
We're not going to dip.
I put my hand up on your hip. When I dip, you dip, we dip. You put your hand up on my hip. When you dip, I dip, we dip.
Welcome back to another episode of To Have and To Hold. I'm always accompanied with my beloved bride. Hi, babe.
Hi.
And we're excited for you to be joining us again. And in today's episode, grab your drink, because we are toasting to our differences, which there's not a lot of those.
Sure.
Alrighty then. Cheers. Wonderful. So we've had some great feedback on the podcast, so we thank you all for sharing. So please do remember to like, comment, subscribe, let us know your thoughts. But specifically, we got some good feedback on just the temperament. So we hope that the last episode was fruitful for you in your marriage and your relationships. Today's going to be kind of, I guess, building on that idea. And we're going to be talking about essentially the concept of how to fight fair. Right? And not physically fight, like put 'em up, but argue effectively in, of course, marriage, but also just in relationships in general. During these,
How about resolve conflict?
yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Is resolve conflict. I like that. Let's stick with that. So we're here to resolve conflict. Yes. Okay. And especially in today's really turbulent times where we feel or see and witness and experience where there's just a difficulty of people dialoguing, resolving conflict, just a lot of chaos and confusion. And that's in just the world itself, more or less, in our home. So we're going to talk about some things that we can kind of think about, pray about, but also utilize practically in our everyday efforts to resolve conflict. So the first thing that seems like probably one of the more difficult things to do is that when you are...
Can I interject?
Of course you can.
Okay, so there's a few things that I want to talk about. So when you talked about differences, and there's not a whole lot of them, as if differences are bad. Differences are not bad in one another. In fact, I don't think that if we were the same, right? Well, for one, I don't think we'd be married if everything was the same, right? But I think that we have to look at differences in a positive way, and that they help us to grow as a person in all facets, including spirituality. And so in a marriage, you'll see that you're going to highlight another person's defects, right?
Areas that could be improved upon.
Right?
Yeah.
Blind spots. And you really can help your spouse, as we're supposed to, is not make you like me, or vice versa, make me try to be like you, but rather how do we grow in holiness and our marriage, right, in this path. And so differences are not, I would say, are not a bad thing. The other thing too, as you mentioned, outside in the state of affairs, the evil one is alive and well, and he's everywhere, right?
Looking for someone to devour. souls to
Looking for
devour.
someone to devour. Resist him, solid in your faith. And so, and how do I know that's the evil one? Because he's causing so much division, destruction, and that's really what he wants to do. He wants to destroy families. He wants to destroy relationships. So we know these things are going to emerge. We know that we're going to be tempted. And so how do we handle that when that occurs?
Exactly. And I think that's key, is really just to kind of empower you all with the gift of dialogue and how we can approach it, because make no mistake, as Nichole stated, the evil one is working overtime, him and all his little minions. And the quickest way to get the world out of sorts is to get family out of sorts, and really to kind of disrupt the nuclear family in that sense. So the first thing that we would recommend is something that seems pretty basic, but pretty difficult in the context of when you're approaching confrontation and or an argument, right? Is to start in prayer.
Right. And that's good, because it actually gauges if we can't sit and pray together, then that may be a good indicator that I'm not ready to address it. My thoughts. So psychologically, what happens is that if we are reacting in such a way that has triggered a fight, flight, or freeze response, then really I'm emotionally flooded and I can't access the part of my brain that I need to access in order for us to really resolve our conflict. I'm just not in that place. So in those moments, instead of trying to force ourselves to try to resolve something, which it won't happen. It's almost like those are the times where you're more likely to say something that later on you're going to regret. So it would be, I think, good judgment to say, I know this is important and I want to resolve it, but I'm not at a place to do so. Let me step away and do some things in order to diffuse this strong emotion I'm having. So one of the things I like to do is go into the adoration chapel. And if that's not available, then I like to go in my room and journal, or maybe just go and work out, go take a run or something that I could work out the strong, intense emotion.
So it kind of folded into kind of two things, right? Is that you start in prayer, and that's really going to be a gauge of where you are. And hopefully you can do that beforehand. Nichole had mentioned, and maybe you can articulate it even more or elaborate on it, but just from a psychology perspective, right? When you talked about not being able to access that part of your brain, essentially that's going to be more objective, more rational, less emotional. And you use an example all the time when you're dealing with your clients, especially your kids, that I always appreciate. And you talk about how, this is the part,
your amygdala.
Your amygdala, and which is where your emotions,
the fight, or freeze reaction.
Yeah. And then this part would be your
prefrontal cortex,
where you're accessing
this part that you can, basically emotional regulation, but planning, organizing, essentially the area of our mind or brain that we need in order to resolve conflict.
So if you are emotional and you're in that fight, flight, or freeze, you've done flipped your lid.
Right. And you can't access that.
You can't access this part, and so you're right here. And so that's always just helpful to me. I'm a simple person, simple brain. So it helps me say is, if you're at this point where you're here and you can access that part, and we can enter into prayer. But if you're here, then we need to, as Nichole said, we need to be able to deal with that. So if you can't start in prayer, then kind of really the segue to that is, well, then we need to take time to kind of de-escalate, defuse, healthy coping mechanisms, prayers by yourself, right? And praying for specifically the grace to be able to resolve this. Praying for your spouse. whether it's hurt that was caused by one another intentionally or unintentionally, whatever it may be that you need to address, take that to the prayer or take that to the 10K you got to go run, because that's how fired up you are about something. But it's just being able to exercise healthy coping mechanisms in order for you to get to that point where you can actually start the resolution process in prayer.
So here's the thing: if I flip my lid, as we talked about, and I'm not at a place that I can talk to you, I'm not reasonable at this point, right? I'm too emotional about it, and I'm in the wrong, but I flip my lid, and maybe I am justified. Maybe I have a good reason, or maybe I have very reasonable points I want to convey. I'm not going to be able to do that with my when I flip my lid. On the vice versa, now if you flipped your lid and I'm at this place where I can access it and I can make a reasonable argument, it's almost like, and do you remember the Charlie Brown episodes where the teacher was always like, oh, wah, oh, wah, oh, wah, oh, wah, right? Yeah. So no matter how reasonable I am, if you flip your lid, it's just all you're taking in at that moment is my nonverbals. And so if I'm upset, my nonverbals are not likely, well, you tell me, if I'm upset, do I show a pleasant face or not so pleasant?
When you're upset?
When I'm upset.
No.
Right. So, I mean, look at these eyebrows. There's not a way that I can, I can have a pleasant face. I mean, it just automatically goes like this. And there's no way of hiding it, right? I'm upset. You can see it. And sometimes I like to put my hand up on my hip. We're not going to dip.
And you dip, we dip.
We're not going to dip. But I do like to put my hand, right? And I get upset. And then sometimes I even extend my finger, right? So I'm upset and this is all you're taking in. And what you're saying, it's not safe right now. We can't go there, right?
Non-verbally, you're saying. Right.
Right.
You could be saying whatever you want.
I could be now making the most rational argument out of the words, but 90% of the communication, you're taking in my nonverbals and saying it's not safe. She is over the top, and I'm not listening, right? The other thing you made a good point, though. You talked about if you're in the wrong. And so I flip my lid, and you're in the wrong. The way to diffuse is not to say, dismiss my feeling, my strong reaction that anyone under the same circumstance would have. To dismiss me would be the wrong thing to say, and I see that you're upset. Why don't you go and walk it off? Why don't you go do something else? The best thing to do at that moment is just try to connect with the person. So the way I do that is, again, in anybody else in the same circumstance would feel the same way. The best thing to do would be, wow, I can see that it's upsetting you, and I'm so sorry for doing that, for upsetting you. Meet them where they are in that emotion, somehow showing empathy, right? If there's somehow I can put myself in your shoes and feel that. There's sometimes, and we haven't talked about families of origin, but the impact of our childhood experiences can impact the way we see the situation. So perhaps I'm not only upset with you, but I'm upset with lots of different things that happened in my childhood.
That remind you of those. So this specific situation reminds you of all of those experiences. And then you bring in, like we share, you bring it in the dump truck, right?
Yes.
It's like beep, 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 beep. And you're just dumping it all into that one specific incident where I may have caused you similar type of hurt.
Right.
And then it kind of really distracts us from the actual issue at hand.
However, the thing is not to say, well, I'm not responsible for that. Again, trying to connect, the way you diffuse the emotion is by connecting with them and showing empathy. I know that must be awful. I know that you're hurt. I know that whatever it is, or I can see that you're upset. I can see that you are hurt, and I don't want to hurt you. When you're ready, let's talk about this.
I don't want to hurt you anymore.
But the thing is that in that moment, when you're saying, I want to, talk about it, or I don't want to hurt you. Your nonverbals also have to match that message, because if you're saying it but your eyes are like this, what does that tell you?
Right. I mean, I wear my emotion on my sleeve, right? So, and hence the wrinkle that I've got going on right there.
And for an extrovert, it's very easy. It's easier for you to do that than it is for an introvert.
Right.
And so, recognizing that you do have wear your emotions on your sleeve. So again, you have to be really mindful of that when you're conveying, because otherwise it just looks like sarcasm.
Okay, so let's kind of recap at least those, because we started off with start in prayer.
Right.
And of course, if that's not a good place, you're not in a good place. So we're kind of branching off to a couple of things, but these are really important when we're talking about resolving conflict. You're not ready to do so, then we need to somehow be able to break. Now, think about, there's no sequence of these steps, meaning what you just described is a lot of, it takes a lot of self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-control, self-possession, and a whole lot of intentional humility and understanding. Why do I say that? Because what Nichole just described is a whole lot of stuff that's back and forth. You've got to be able to understand your own wounds and your own pain. Like, I'm not ready for this right now. I'm not at that point. At the same time, recognizing where your partner may be, right? Where your spouse may be, or the person that you are in conflict with may be, emotionally, mentally, all of that. And it's trying to find a way that we can both exercise humility, both exercise empathy, see where we are, and then determine what's the best next step
Course
for
of action.
of action for it. So it's not like it's going to be, well, nope, John and Nichole said to start in prayer and we got to do this, or now we got to go off and I got to go run 5 miles, or wait, hold on a minute, I need to acknowledge your pain and show empathy. It is an ebb and a flow that you each will have to figure out within the context of whatever that scenario may be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think also the other thing is that we don't both have to be ready in prayer, and to the degree that I'm going to say prayer, I'm not going to lead prayer. Mm-hmm. It's okay that if I am so upset that you lead prayer. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a beautiful gesture. Can I invite God into this? Mm-hmm. And take each other's hands, and let's demonstrate. Take each other's hands, mm-hmm. and I know that you're upset, and I see you, but I want to, somehow resolve this. Is it okay if I lead us in prayer? Mm-hmm. Now, you might, give me roll your eyes or your body. Right, you might do that, but in that moment, and
be all limp in your hands.
That's good. Yes, that's right. And at that moment, I have a decision to make. Do I really want to resolve it? Do I really love my spouse? Am I going to let the nonverbals, when you have every right to be upset right now, even though maybe I want it, if the same thing happened, maybe I want it, but I'm going to honor you and where you are right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to move beyond it. And I would say the next thing, too, is that it's nice holding your hands.
It's nice holding yours, too.
Oh, thank you.
This is nice.
So even, in prayer, I think the other thing is another step, I would say, is what's the goal? What's the, the shared goal? Mm-hmm. And, again, I want to bring you to God. So in that moment, if I'm thinking, my responsibility is to bring you back to God, even though we're upset right now. This is the vocation of service. Mm-hmm. I really don't think that you deserve maybe my love at this moment, but I know that out of reverence for Christ, I'm going to love you, and I need to pray. Mm-hmm. And maybe now you're kind of giving me these nonverbals, like you're not there, and I feel disrespected. But I'm going to make a decision to move beyond it and think about my goal. So
this would be a specific example of the threshold between love as a decision.
Yes.
Right? Moving beyond the emotion, because we don't feel like that. We don't feel it right now. Mm-hmm. But making the decision to, we're going to resolve this. Mm-hmm. Whatever it is, we're both committed, and we have to go into that scenario that way. And, letting our our body know that our will's in control.
That's right.
That is Nicole's saying, because honestly, if you get this part down, right, then, because if you think that for some strange reason you will never argue, that,
Right.
couples won't argue, that's just, you're setting yourself up for disappointment and a rude awakening. You will argue, hopefully not a whole lot of arguments, right? But you're going to argue, and when you do argue, it's how you argue that is going to determine whether or not you're going to have really a blessed marriage and be able to resolve conflict appropriately. So that, I think, is a great example of that is really crossing the threshold from love as an emotion to love as a decision. That even though I'm not acting like I'm not receiving, even at that point, in that example, receiving Nicole's love, because I'm just, my nonverbals, I'm rolling my eyes, my hands are like, yeah, whatever. She's holding my hand, she's rubbing her hands, and I don't even want to touch, right, her, and then, but she's loving me through it anyway.
Right. So at that moment, I'm called to be Christ-like. Now, you are too. And one of the things,
It doesn't excuse me or
Right.
dismiss the fact that I still need to treat you as a dignified child. It's another point that we want to make, is recognizing that we're both made in the image and likeness of God. We both have dignity that's inherent to that reality, and that we need to uphold that. And as you were saying, that we are being subordinate to one another out of reverence to Christ, right? So we talked about that in Ephesians 5:21. So that's the other idea of going into this, is like, recognize this is a sacrament of service. This is a sacrament of selfless love that we need to sanctify and purify one another, even when they're not deserving or acting deservingly. They're always deserving of it, and that's why Christ gave his life, right? But I think that's really key, is what you described. So again, it's an art and a science to some degree.
Yeah. I think that, in our spiritual maturity is knowing, again, it's using not the lower faculties, right? It's really it's going the higher faculties and exerting our will, even though we don't feel like it. It does take maturity, right?
Yeah, and I think, we say this a lot to, especially those out, I know there's some of you that are preparing for marriage, right? And a lot of people prepare for the wedding day. Right? And it's all filled with, I know there's stress of, honestly, the silly stress, just kind of, rain on your parade out there, worrying about the cake and the photographer and the wedding favors that nobody really remembers but you, maybe, right? But it's preparing for the marriage, that because once you are married and that wedding day is done, life hits you. And it could be your first argument a week into it, when you're, got home from the honeymoon, and now you got to figure out, wait a minute, I didn't realize this about you with regards to your cleanliness at home or whatever, right? You just kind of lay your clothes out as you walk in the room. I don't ever. Yeah. Anywho, so you just gotta, this is just kind of preparing you for that we are supposed to uphold one another as being made in the image and likeness of God, which is a huge struggle in today's world, but definitely in today's family, that we're made in that image and likeness, and therefore we have a dignity that we must hold and ultimately give back and respect.
In those moments, where perhaps your spouse is showing the nonverbals aren't necessarily positive, I think, and so then it makes it harder for us to love in those moments, because we think we're not, our spouse is not deserving. But really what we're supposed to do is imitate Christ. And I think about, at the end of life, I often think I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, right? I can't think at the end of life, when the Lord looks at those moments, and I can't say, well, did you see what John did? Did you see how he was treating me? I don't think that that's going to fly. I think that the Lord is going to ask me about reassessing my own life, that I had a decision to make, and did I honor my vows at that moment, despite whether he was deserving or not. So just something in terms of reframing your thoughts, and not so much what John is doing, but more so what our responsibility to do in that moment. God will take care of our spouse. He has to answer to the same sort of questions. So not to do God's work, just allow God to be God. And
you don't change hearts. God doesn't even change hearts, right? It's just a matter of our own free will to embrace that, and God will worry about the cultivation. We just got to be able to sow those seeds of love. And I think that'll speak to it when we witness to that in our own. I mean, imagine the witness that you provide to one another, whomever is on the other side of that argument, when you just love them through it.
Right.
I mean, even, that's a de-escalation technique in and of itself, right? If I'm over here, super heated, intense, and Nicole's staying down here, I hear you, I understand you, right? And I'm just, but you're not really. And then she's like, I'm sorry about that. And then eventually, right, I'm going to meet her. Or
If my behaviors match what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, if it's incongruent.
Don't, right, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah, if it's I hear you.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
I
which is good. It's good because your tone has to match. Your volume has to match.
That's
your
right.
posture has to match. Yeah, and so it's a lot of work and it's hard, and that's why in those moments we really have to check ourselves. Figure, am I in a place that I can honor my spouse? If I'm not, then what can I do so then I can diffuse this emotion and come back to it?
Now I want to bring us back to the thing we talked about. You brought up family of origins, and we'll probably go into a conversation about a little bit deeper into that at some point in an episode. But the fact that I may have done something that may have triggered a wound in Nichole that brings back what we call the dump truck, right? The emotional dump truck. And so what we as we grow in our knowledge of one another and in our married vocation and in our relationships with other people, it's working hard to cure the disease, not just treat symptoms. So when I know that there's something, I'll use a simple example, right? If I haven't eaten, how does that work out for us?
Yeah, you're hangry.
I'm hangry. I get hangry. I'm a work in progress. And there's often times if we're traveling or we're out and about, and I'll snap, right? I'll get attitude, whatever. And does Nichole take it personal? Not at all. Maybe early on in life, but now
There may have been a time.
but now what's your typical response? You see the symptom is I'm giving you attitude. Right?
Now it's like, get this man food.
Yeah.
Let's pull over to the next exit.
And she'll say that. She'll reach over and she goes, all right, we need to get daddy some food. Right? And I would be like, yeah, we need to get daddy some food. We need to make that In-N-Out stop, and we need to just go animal fries. Just kidding. Well, maybe not. Anyway, so I think it's curing versus seeing the symptom and then like dealing with that. Right? So seeing even with Nichole and the more serious example where I may have done something where she maybe feels dismissed by an action or behavior, and that may be a childhood experience that she's still working through, and that dump truck comes in and it's boom, and I'm going, wait a minute, I didn't even mean to, and I'm over here trying to explain my way out of it.
Yeah, justify your
justify
reaction.
justify even my action. I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa, you're overreacting,
Right.
and not really trying to exercise empathy and demonstrate a willingness to actually go in like a surgeon, right, and say, wait a minute, these are side effects to a bigger issue. All right, and as you start to dialogue and communicate and spend the time and examine and just work through our wounds together as a couple to purify and sanctify one another, those things come to mind. Wait a minute. I see the disease we need to cure here, and then we start having honest conversation. We do it all the time where it's like, you know what, I have that's an issue of mine, right? It's a wound I have, and this is my reaction. And then we almost start apologizing before we, get upset. Like, maybe I took that the wrong way.
Yeah.
This is a wound from
Although there's a timing in that conversation, because even though, again, we said at the beginning, our spouses are more likely to see our blind spots, but that doesn't give us the right to point it out in an inopportune time. Right. So there's things that, you or I will recognize, and we want to talk about it because we want to try to help each other heal. And again, you've talked about in past episode about bringing your wife back to heaven without spot or blemish, right? So how do you do that? Well, it's not like pointing the finger, or you recognize there is this wound and we're going to address it right now, despite whether I'm ready or not. It's more so, that I'd say, hey, sweetheart, I love you. And just kind of gauge, like, how is he feeling right now? Can we have a discussion. And he knows typically when I do those things specifically in that way, it's a serious discussion. And so then you have, when I ask you, then you have the freedom to say yes or no. And I can't be bothered by if you said, no, it's not the right time. Okay. I have to honor him and walk away, or we can talk about something else until you're ready.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us really to the last point. I mean, there's a lot to this dialogue and conversation, and we can continue to have that with you all, but it's just the respecting of the differences, and that includes the timing, right? We talked about the temperaments and my processing time versus your processing time. I may be ready to deal with conflict right now, and you may not be. You need 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever time frame that may be. And it's really having a respect for one another in those, right? I don't want to go to bed with that unresolved conflict, and you may be okay with that, right? Which we don't recommend at all. But it's trying to work towards a greater understanding, and again, that shared goal that Nichole talked about. Ultimately, we love one another. We want the best for one another, and true love is willing the good of the other and doing something about it, right? So, it's respecting the differences though, and recognizing that whether you're reading the nonverbals or recognizing this may be a family of origin wound, or you know what, I did it again, I didn't follow through, and you know what, honestly, that I've done that 3 times in the last 2 weeks, and there's a lot of that, and it takes again, using your higher faculties. It takes a lot of spiritual maturity, mental maturity, emotional maturity to be able to do that, and just also respecting one another's differences.
I'd also say, prayer is so important. We talked about starting, in prayer, which is always a good way to start. But then also I'd say away from that, we've talked about the importance of prayer as couples, but individually. And if you see something and perhaps your spouse is not ready to discuss it, continue to pray for your spouse with that. Again, you're more likely to see your spouse's blind spots before your spouse. So if you recognize it, just pray for your spouse. You might ask for intercession of Saint Joseph, or perhaps another saint. But I think it's so helpful. And I remember specifically there was a time where there was a disagreement, and I just remember having the desire to say something at that moment, but I think my guardian angel knew it wouldn't be, it probably wouldn't have helped the situation. And so it was almost like I literally felt like my guardian angel put their hand over my mouth and pulled me away. I just felt like this, with clarity, with just great clarity that the time was not right. And I ended up going to my room, and I remember you came in later, and we were, we were on good terms. It wasn't like it wasn't that contentious. But I remember I don't even remember the situation, but anyway, whatever it was resolved through just me. Like, you recognized it when I just was able to back away.
And gave me some time to deal with it. And obviously, in a very spiritual way, right? That could have been, the guardian angels intervening at that moment, or our, saints interceding on our behalf, just prayerfully to allow me to diffuse, process, and then come to a rational, right, decision on whatever that scenario would have been.
And I say the other thing too, a question you may want to ask yourself when there is a contention is this going to matter, 2 days from now, 2 weeks from now, 2 years from now, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, those are, if you really want to try to make it as simple as possible, to where, if my spouse if I was to find out my spouse was going to be gone, or have a terminal disease in the next day, would this situation really matter? And there are some yeses to that, right? Like, their soul's going to be at stake if we don't deal with this issue. But in a lot of the trivial stuff that we deal with on a day in, day out basis, it may feel a lot at that moment, but maybe not so much, right, if you put it in that context. And so we hope and pray that that was something that was, again, useful for you, that you can apply and to your everyday life, to your everyday communication. Everything's rooted in Christ when it comes to the podcast and what we're trying to offer. And so if you think you're doing it on your own and Christ isn't at the center of the foundation, we're just not going to be successful without God at the helm. We're in for some tough times. So, brothers and sisters in Christ, we hope that this was helpful to you. We ask again, share. Do us a favor, right? Go out there and give us a review, give us a rating, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. Definitely share. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, share and get people to be exposed to this if you feel that it's blessed your marriage. And we remind you again to bring your favorite beverage, even if it's just some good old H2O, so we can always start off in a Thanksgiving toast. So again, cheers to all of our differences here in this house and out there in the world. And God bless you and keep you always, and we'll see you on the next episode.